you've never seen something like this before, Jordan Peterson took an entire BBC panel to school on politics and racism, and this has got to be one of his most impressive intellectual displays ever. And you know why that is? This discussion happened soon after Jordan Peterson was on the path to recovery after a benzodiazepine addiction that even landed him in a coma. Despite his frail appearance, though, I want you to watch him push back against a panel that is clearly not on his side.
I know a lot of people who have staggeringly successful careers, and they're often loath to go into a political field despite the tremendous expertise they've developed, because they have to put everything that they've already accomplished on hold or in hawk, in a sense, to enter the public sphere. And I think one of the I understand the conflict of interest problem, but one of the problems with that is that the most highly competent people in many fields are dissuaded from a political career because it requires the unproductive sacrifice of everything they've built. And so what that does, in some sense, is deprive us of some of the best people who could be considering politics as a mode of public service.
Why do we assume that such people are the best people? They're obviously not the best people for the job.
Because they've demonstrated extreme competence in at least one area of the
That's banking, that's that person. This is why we're in the situation where we are with people like politicians that we have at the moment that are corrupt. There's no transparency, there's no accountability that you get in industry, and we don't even have it in our politics at the moment.
But that's not
because
why
of
you
this
have corruption.
attitude
No.
That what is perceived as a good leader.
No, that's not why you have that problem.
Is.
Most people who are successful in their given field aren't corrupt. It's very difficult to become successful and be corrupt.
So
I know people like to think that, but it's just not true.
Corruption is good, it's acceptable.
No. Look, 3% of the population is psychopathic, and it never really goes above that. And the reason that it never goes above that is because being psychopathic is not a very good strategy. And so the idea that people in power are corrupt, by definition, especially if they've built up their stature and influence as a consequence of competence, is simply wrong. And so you do want people who've demonstrated high levels of competence in at least one other field to serve as potential political candidates. What else would you use as a criteria for their ability?
So why is that 3% elevated as our leaders? Why is that 3% elevated as our leaders?
They aren't. That's wrong. And to think that way is counterproductively cynical. It's absolutely the case that institutions have a proclivity towards corruption under some circumstances. That's true of all institutions. But to blindly assume that that's more characteristic, let's say, of your political leaders than it is of you, for example, as a person, or that it's more specifically characteristic of political leaders than people who are operating at the highest level of their capacity in other areas. It's an empty sort of cynicism. It doesn't serve people well, and it's not true of reasonable governments or countries. It's simply not true.
You know what's wrong with this conversation to begin with? People end up talking in circles about whether it is politics that makes you corrupt or whether it is the corrupt people that vie for public office in the first place. I'm honestly not going to take this lady's question on its face because there's clearly an element of venting out frustration. But I think that we can use this as a jumping board to say this. The question is inverted on its head. Let me explain. It's not that the most corrupt and psychotic people rise up to the top of the political ladder, but the fact that the most honest and intellectual class is disincentivized from pursuing a political attitude precisely because of a cynical and counterproductive attitude like that. Why would an academic or a thinker or an honest outsider want to join politics when there's a society that has gotten so used to making a punching bag out of political leaders for everything that is wrong with society? I mean, take someone like Jordan Peterson himself. He has long been asked to join Canada's political arena just for how good a mind like him could do in the country's power corridors. And yet, a large part of what dissuades him from it is seeing how politicians often have to become the ultimate scapegoat by a population that has already forgotten the core tenets of individual responsibility in the first place and wants their politics to reflect the collective identity-based worldviews that they stand for. I remember reading Jordan Peterson's last book called Beyond Order, which came out in 2021, And there was one chapter from it that stood out above all else. It's aptly titled, quote, "Do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement." That's a direct message to the new generation today. Simply put, it's really easy to sling mud at a system that works, even though imperfectly, but it's hard to appreciate the fact that it works in the first place. Unfortunately, that's what makes politics a muddied water today, while also creating the vicious cycle that starts by demonizing the political arena and ends with preventing the best people from joining its ranks. And by the way, it's important to remember that this is not a blanket truth for the entire world. Countries range from functioning social democracies all the way to corrupt dictatorships and dynasties. That's why it's important to particularize the charge against politics into the country and its ideals. Perhaps if we went back to the same ideals of individualism, free speech, and limited government that have defined us, politics itself would also start to clean itself up over time. In the meantime, you need a degree of gratitude and humility for the somewhat functioning systems that do exist, as well as a realization that we first need to completely rid ourselves of the vices that we so eagerly see in large institutions.
With the revelations from cricket's Azim Rafiq and footballers still taking the knee, what does this say about racism as a continuing undercurrent in present-day Britain?
I think the same point I made earlier applies, is that things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own account. The question is, who, when, what, exactly? Because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. You know, racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low-resolution thinking. And what I mean by that is we use all these terms frequently in discussions like this that are
He was
containers of undifferentiated content.
He was repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's had people contact him. If it walks like a duck, Jordan, talks like a duck,
I'm not
it's a duck. It's racism.
I'm not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about institutional racism in cricket. Mm-hmm. He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem. The concept of structural racism. It's too imprecise.
Jordan can't be expected to know of a relatively obscure case of racist abuse at an English cricket club, but just to get it out of the way, the incident which happened back in 2020 did indeed smack of true racism against a cricket player of Pakistani origin named Azim Rafiq. But you know why it's interesting? The entire sports apparatus and the legal system up to the highest level stood in support of Azim when an investigation concluded that racist abuse had indeed occurred. For some reason, everyone seems to completely forget that when they immediately charge an entire country of being institutionally racist, in fact, the fallout was so severe that the world of cricket is still reeling from its impact, with major sponsors like Nike that pulled their advertising and many competent people in the top managerial class of English cricket forced to resign. I think Jordan Peterson's point about abstracting racism is more nuanced than this panel seems to get. Let me quote Ben Shapiro on this because he said it best in one simple sentence, and I quote, "Vagary is the enemy of action, specificity is the friend of action. When you don't know what or who to fight when it comes to racism, there's an allure in seeing institutional racism everywhere, and this is what paralyzes people into inaction. When the enemy is as abstract as the entire society, all you're really left to do is tear down the entire social structure that you think is racist. Maybe that's what we're seeing right now.
I don't think
but
it's
when
fair
we
to
talk
say
about-
that what you did was racist. I don't believe that.
But we're talking
I think
about
what you
Jordan.
did was a mark of respect. And now that may have been inappropriate and it may have been taken wrong, but that doesn't mean it was racist.
But Jordan,
and so we are going to be precise about it.
Define why the concept of structural racism. And we have a problem in British society. We have a problem particularly in sport. And we also have a problem when it comes to our definitions of racism, because people tend to lump people of different minority community backgrounds together. You know,
And how do you talk about structural racism?
I'm
going to need to bring other people in as well.
But the thing for me that I think is so powerful is this concept of the bystander, is the idea of the person who may think of themselves not as a racist, who may not have joined in this poor young man being bullied in the way that he was.
I need to mention Stella simply because he has talked about it himself today, Azim Rafiq, that he has apologised for some anti-Semitic tweets that he put out several years ago.
What I think is very powerful is how clear and compelling his apology is and how he's recognised it.
I have to say, it was really something to watch a panel gang up on Jordan Peterson like this, with the eye rolls, the mocking hand gestures, and the constant calls for him to clarify what he meant. It was almost a perfect amalgam of arrogance and innocence of what he's actually saying. But there certainly is a vital lesson that you can take away from this. The best way to approach the debate of racism is by doing two things. Ask for specificity in the racist incident you're being called to condemn, then have the strength to be able to stop at individual incidents instead of directing your anger to abstract or overarching systems that you can't fight. I think anyone that understands how the human mind works would agree with that. Look around you and you see how the failure to approach the racism debate in this way has ended up resurrecting past racism in new forms by putting us into narrow tribal identities and pitting us against each other. Perhaps there's even a tendency for that to happen because humans in general are always looking to offload personal responsibility onto other people, institutions, and ideas. And in that case, Jordan Peterson's presence on a panel like this is exactly the necessary counterbalance that the audience needed.